Hello and welcome to the Centre for Brexit Studies YouTube channel. I'm joined here by Dr. Steven McCabe. He's Associate Professor at IDEA and a Senior Fellow at the Centre for Brexit Studies, both here at Birmingham City University. So Steve, we seem to be edging more towards a no deal Brexit every single day. Do you think this will really happen, and did you see this coming?
Well, to answer the second part first, kind of. I mean, it was always one of the possibilities, but let's face it, in the sort of referendum campaign was not particularly explicit. It was seen as the sort of the worst case scenario, and certainly sort of in the premiership of Theresa May was seen to be something that was going to be avoided. Now, of course, with the here and now is we have a new Prime Minister, Boris Johnson, who's made it absolutely explicit that he is prepared and seems very willing to take the country out on a no deal. We have this sort of standoff, if you like, in the negotiations between him and the EU. The EU are not going to budge on backstops and the sort of withdrawal agreement, which has always really been negotiated as they see it in good faith. So, to answer the sort of the question, yeah, I think it's a very likely possibility with all the attendant consequences for the economy.
So from a West Midlands angle, you of course live and work in the area. What impact do you think no deal will have on the West Midlands?
Well, it's certainly one of the things that my parents who came here as they have jobs in Birmingham, certainly my dad worked in the motor industry, as mum did, until she retired at Lucas's. The motor industry is going to be very badly affected. I mean, of course, we're probably the most landlocked of the cities, or furthest from the sort of the sea. And given that we're being told that there's going to be problems in terms of the supply chain for the automotive industry, but now the food chain, it does begin to make you wonder that sort of things could get pretty bad. So the West Midlands, like many areas, are going to be badly affected. And of course, the touchstone is always London. London will be affected, but much less so. And I think we're one of the sort of the great industrial cities that sort of, let's face it, we've had enough problems in the sort of the last 20, 30, 40 years, probably going back to sort of the election of Margaret Thatcher in 1979. It's probably the last thing that we need.
So Boris Johnson has been in the job for just over 2 weeks now. What are you making of his premiership so far?
Right, interesting. I mean, Boris, of course, quite clearly is not stupid. Quite the contrary. He's got the sort of the job that he's always coveted. I think he's going to want to hang on to it. He promised that he would sort of leave and be prepared to sort of to leave under no deal. I think he's prepared to do that. I also think, of course, that sort of his promises, the amount of money he spent, gives the impression that sort of there was no problem in terms of austerity, which, let's face it, the country has suffered from by and large for the last 10 years or so since the global financial crisis. Clearly, he's gearing up for an election. I mean, he's an interesting character, as I say, but anybody who knows anything about Boris will realise that sort of just because Boris says something, it doesn't mean to say it always happens in the way that he claimed it would. So I think there could be a few sort of twists and turns before we sort of get to October the 31st.
So do you think there will be a general election in the next few months? And if so, who do you think would come out on top?
Right, well, it's really interesting. Will Boris Johnson call an election? I think yes, because of course his majority is so slim that to mean that Brexit notwithstanding, doing anything is going to be sort of nigh and impossible, certainly if it becomes controversial. He leads a very divided party. Then, of course, so is the Labour Party. So I suspect if he can do, I mean, it much depends on what happens when sort of Parliament reconvenes on the 3rd of September. And quite clearly, if there is a no confidence motion and he's defeated, then he's almost duty bound to go to sort of the country. But of course, he may choose to sort of go immediately after Brexit, and of course, he'll be sort of proclaiming he was the man that sort of did what Theresa May couldn't do. As terms of the outcome, I see it sort of it'll be we'll end up with sort of the fragmented politics we've got, and there's every possibility we'll end up with a sort of a coalition of possibly the sort of Conservatives if they sort of get enough seats, and the DUP or maybe some other sort of fringe party. But of course, I don't rule out the sort of the fact that, and let's face it, McDonnell was up in Scotland this week and was making very sort of calming noise about sort of the possibility of another referendum there. Labour, SNP coalition in the future, or some sort of pact. So I think the political discontinuity and disequilibrium, if you like, that will continue for sort of the next while. In fact, it may be something that becomes a sort of permanent feature of the British political landscape.
So it's no secret that you are very much a Remainer. Did you think back in June 2016 that the Brexit process would go this way?
If I'm honest, no. But I always had a sort of. From the point at which the decision to call the referendum was called, I said that it would probably sort of be a leave vote, because I think the people. Yeah, well, when you talk to people, there is a sort of a groundswell of they want change, and it's one of the problems. They want change, but they're not quite sure what it consists of. And I think that they're still willing to believe that sort of leaving the EU will be sort of somehow beneficial to their everyday lives and sort of their future prospects. And it's only when people see the sort of the consequence of the decision, which is what I firmly believe, that maybe they'll start to think differently. But by that point, it's probably a bit late. I still I'd add to that. I think that there may still be some twists and turns, but if anything, the potential for conciliation between the EU and the UK, it seems to be sort of lessening, not growing. There's not a conducive environment to reach an updated deal, or something that sort of avoids the worst excesses of no deal.
So what do you think are going to be the next moves from the more remaining parties, so like the Lib Dems, SNP, Greens, etc.?
Well, many people, Polly Toynbee in The Guardian in particular, has been calling for sort of a grand coalition. I think the big problem with that is that sort of the Greens and the Liberal Democrats are still seen to be important but marginal. What you really need is a sort of a much more united Labour Party, and as I said a few moments ago, the Labour Party is pretty divided in its own way. Let's face it, we've got sort of northern constituencies who voted to leave, and MPs there realise or recognise the sort of the dangers that they're seen to be sort of too in favour of remaining or going against what is seen as the will of the people, then they will suffer as a consequence. So I think that the difficulty is that this grand coalition is possibly not destined to happen just when it's needed. The no confidence vote may happen. There's been talk over the sort of last couple of years of sort of a government of national unity, which would encompass this grand coalition. The difficulty, if I may sort of say, is that as long as Jeremy Corbyn is in control, and let's face it, he's of the sort of the Lexit variety, he believes in sort of leaving the EU because, of course, it allows for sort of greater nationalisation of industries, and I don't think he's ever really been on board with the Remain camp. His statements now are drawn very grudgingly, it seems.
And what about the likes of the Brexit Party?
Well, the Brexit Party is interesting because quite clearly, you look at UKIP, which of course is effectively a spent force, and quite clearly has lurched to sort of the hard right. It seems to be under sort of the influence of, who knows whose leadership this week. It really is. It's become a basket case. If the country leaves on the 31st of October, which seems very possible, and we have left the EU, and particularly under no deal, then the Brexit Party, it was a bit of a one-trick pony. Its purpose is served, but given the personalities involved, I suspect that they won't go away. That they are of course they won't be MEPs any longer. Of course, quite clearly what they would be hoping for is that they would get a bounce and get credit for having stimulated this process, because many of them are Eurosceptics, and of course I'm thinking about the likes of Anne Widdecombe, that they may get some sort of bounce and end up back in Parliament, in her case, and of course in the case of Nigel Farage, to actually sort of win a seat. So I think that they will remain some sort of force, but will they sort of become a party that can broker power? I doubt it. Having said that, of course, if we don't leave, and of course there's also a possibility that may occur, then I'm sure that they will be agitating in sort of the background. And let's face it, the Brexit Party in particular is Boris Johnson's worst nightmare, because they will make his life miserable.
So what are you hoping to see in the next couple of months before the October 31st deadline?
Well, given that we're talking about sort of supply chain problems coming up to Christmas, you better get your sort of Christmas wishes in early. It won't happen, but I'd like to see a revocation of Article 50, that we remain. But having said that, because of course that's what I've always believed is the best way of solving this problem, and let's face it, it's in our national interest. But I fully accept that a lot of people would be very, very unhappy, and of course some of the parties I've talked about, some of the groupings, have said of course they would be happy to engage in a form of civil disobedience. The reality is that Brexit has created a divide in the sort of the political and social and to some extent economic landscape, and that scar isn't going to heal very sort of soon, whatever happens. So I think I think we're going to have certainly over the next couple of months, more chaos, and I think we're going to sort of reach the cliff edge on the 31st, but I think this time we're actually going to go over, with Theresa May always gave the impression, indeed, you know, the results proved it, that she was willing to sort of to play for more time. She ran out of time. Boris, he's painted himself in a corner. He has to sort of to be seen to sort of fulfil his promise, or effectively he then becomes political toast. So yeah, the next few months are going to be interesting, but scary.
Thank you for joining us, Steve.